This report will describe a pinwheel experiment that took place on April the 7th, 2022. And also following that, there'll be a special report about the turning during the morning of that day on April 7th, because we have 2 hours where the pinwheel set new records for turning. So here's a weather pattern, temperature pattern on that day, April the 7th. Notice the records were set at 2 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the morning. And so that would be this time period. There's not a whole lot of temperature variation. The temperature rose from, say, 53 or something like that, 52 to 55. And that wouldn't really explain why there's such a high level of activity then as compared to other hours. The time of the experimental session from 7:30 to 9:30, that was a time of declining temperature, and there was a thunderstorm, have a lot of rain and some wind, so that might have an impact on the pinwheels. There might be variations in the temperature and causing air convection currents. So we put together some kind of hypothesis if we can. There's high activity in the morning, and it's unclear whether that has a predictive capacity for what occurs later on in the evening. I haven't looked that closely at it, but I haven't not noticed any high correlation. But the assumption is if we're living in a time period where there's high activation in the morning, then that would increase the probability for high activation in the evening. If there's no activity for 10 hours, then we have the strange weather system with a thunderstorm, rain, and wind. Skeptic hypothesis. Well, skeptics might predict a high level of activity because we have such unstable weather that might increase the probability of convection currents. The believers would argue that when the group meets, there should be a higher level of activity of the pinwheels. We're very much interested in the camera setup. I walk in, I enter the room. For example, there's my image in the mirror. I'm setting up I've just set up the camera, and here I'm holding the iPad, taking the photograph that you're seeing right now. So in this particular experiment, the sound of this camera was not activated, so we don't have a record of what people said during the experiment. Here's the activation pattern of that day. We have the record set at 2 and 3, high level of activity after midnight and 1 o'clock, declining level of activity, then no activity for 10 hours. Then we start our 7 o'clock setup and situation, and then the formal meeting from 7:30 to 9:30, and then we have a perhaps residual activity after the meeting. So Thursday afternoon, here's a documentation of what the pinwheels looked like with the blink camera. The blink camera is not activated, but I activated it. And then you see the pinwheels are completely still. And every time I looked all afternoon long, they were completely still. So on the emotional level, I really didn't expect too much to happen, because when you check again and again, you see they're still. There's no reason to think something different will happen. So to what degree are the pinwheels disturbed by the camera setup? Let's see what happens. Here is the camera setup right here. Into the room. You see a little bit of moving around. Clockwise movement and counterclockwise movement. Wait for the turn. And I think it's kind of like an agitation movement. I've noticed when I come up real close to the pinwheels, they sometimes agitate to move one way and back about 1/8 of a turn. The next activation isn't until 9 minutes later. So it would seem that the setup did not really disturb the pinwheels very much, enough to activate the blink camera. They weren't activated by. Well, actually, this was a blink activation that we recorded right here. So the meeting begins at 7:36. activation is counterclockwise, which is unusual. So this is a counterclockwise turn after the original counterclockwise. Haven't had that for a number of weeks. A counterclockwise turning. Here's a clockwise turn. I was the only one present. And soon afterwards, Melanie showed up. This is a strong turn, 1 1/4 turn during the 25-second activation period. Cameras are such that they're designed and programmed that they'll only activate once a minute. So the maximum number of activations would be 60. So here's Melanie's present. Counterclockwise turn. So it's going to slow it down. But it fulfills its obligation of turning the entire time. Here, the next minute, 8:01. You've got a counterclockwise turn. What's going on here? Yeah, 8 o'clock. This is 1 minute later. Here's our counterclockwise turn. So that would suggest to me that the turning is continuing and the camera is ready to expire. Still slowing down, turning back in the opposite direction. So let's look at the pattern of direction of turns. So here from 7 to 8, there were 9 clockwise. 1 counterclockwise, between 8 and 9, 9 clockwise, 10 counterclockwise. So there's a cluster of counterclockwise activations all in the 8 o'clock hour. Here from 9 to 10, there's only 3 counterclockwise. Then for the rest of the evening, they're all clockwise. Let's look at one of them. Here's a counterclockwise turn, left turn. The counterclockwise turns seem to be slower than the clockwise turning. .28. Here's another counterclockwise turn, stronger one, 5/8 of a turn. It seems to be stopping. So here's the same activation pattern we looked at before. Here's the record turning activity early in the morning. Here's the activation pattern. It seems like this supports the believer hypothesis, the group meeting. That's when you're having all the activations, the main activity. Let's look at Friday, the next day. There are 8 activations after midnight. The activation pattern then declined, and it increased, was higher again at 5 o'clock, then it went back down to 0 by 9 o'clock. Here's our special report. We're going to be looking at the example cases from 1 o'clock before the record setting run, and then also at 2 o'clock. It looks pretty much the same. It's hard to draw conclusions from this. Let's look at our example case. 1 o'clock in the morning, and this is a slow turn. It goes 1/4 of a turn clockwise, and then it stops turning, and so the blink system shut down. In a previous case where we had 59 activations in an hour, there was a number of these partial turns. It didn't stay activated. It seemed like it was trying to somehow fit in more activations, as many as it could. But in this particular example case, from an alternate opinion, had a lot of these rapid turnings, clockwise turns, 1 3/8. It is as if the turning is continuous. It's not, doesn't seem like it's slowing down. Maybe a little bit, but in this case, it looks like it's slower. Again, it looks like it's picking up. Here's another example case, 1 o'clock in the morning. But we see, if we compare the 110 to 111, it looks like it's a continuous turning. Maybe it slows down, but it's probably continuously turning the entire time. If it did stop while the blink was watching it, then the blink camera would stop activating. Here's 120. We have another 1 1/4 turn. This is about as rapid as it could go. There's a few 1.5 turns, and I think one example case of 1 3/4 turn, but that's about as fast as you can get from these pinwheels. So here's the next hour. This is the hour where we set the first record of 60 activations in an hour. And a full turn. All of these turns are clockwise. Here's a rare case of a partial activation. The camera is activated by the movement, and then the movement apparently stops, so it stops recording after 10 seconds. In the previous example cases that I had of turns of 59 turn activations during the hour, there were a number of these partial turns, but in this particular day, there doesn't seem to be very many. Just a few. There's a 1 1/4 turn. 2:16 a.m. And another example case. 1 1/4 turn clockwise, 2:41. It seems to be very consistent. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of variation. You see a lot of these strong turns, 1 1/4 turning, very consistent, probably going on the entire time period and even into the next hour after hour. So here's our same activation pattern, our record turning, our no activity, high level of activations during the group session, then the residual activation. It's consistent with what we've seen week after week, and when there's no meeting, then we don't see this surge here. So that leads the group people, us group participants, to think this is something paranormal is happening, because when we're there, we have the phenomena to a greater degree than when we're not. So the camera in this particular case, it didn't seem to affect them substantially. But 9 minutes later, there's the first activation. And there's a lot of activations during the group session. So that seems to support, I would think that supports the believers' hypothesis. The skeptics would predict there should be a higher level. It's rare that we have a thunderstorm phenomena, but it did not seem to produce an exceptional record. That was a little bit above average, the number of activations that we had. It would seem that the fact that we can come up with a skeptical explanation, that might enhance the possibility of actual paranormal phenomena, according to Bachelador's theory. So, because the skeptics, they're not so bothered by the phenomena. The actual phenomena doesn't bother them as much, and so that might facilitate the phenomena occurring.